They laughed first, not the quiet laughter of doubt, but the loud, careless mockery of men who believed they already understood the world and everyone in it. They laughed at the rifle because it did not look the part. They sneered at the way it was acquired, dismissing it as cheap, insignificant, unworthy of serious respect. In their minds, tools determined outcome, labels decided worth, and appearances told the full story. They believed strength only came from what was impressive at a glance. History, however, has never favored those who judge too early. War has a way of stripping away illusions. On paper, battles are decided by numbers, technology, and planning. In reality, they are decided by human beings, by their discipline, their patience, their willingness to adapt, and their refusal to surrender to humiliation or doubt. The rifle they mocked did not change, the man wielding it did not wait for approval. He understood something far more important than reputation, that effectiveness is forged through mastery, not applause. In every conflict, there are moments when arrogance becomes as dangerous as any enemy weapon. Soldiers who believe they already know the limits of possibility stop preparing for surprise. They stop watching carefully. They underestimate the quiet, the unconventional, the overlooked. That kind of thinking has ended more campaigns than poor equipment ever did. The mockery surrounding that rifle was not harmless. It was the sound of overconfidence taking root. The first shot did not announce itself with drama. There were no speeches beforehand, no cheers from the sidelines. There was only calm breathing, controlled movement, and focus narrowed to a single purpose. Precision does not shout. Discipline does not boast. In the unforgiving mathematics of combat, a single accurate decision outweighs a dozen loud assumptions. The rifle did what it was designed to do, guided by steady hands and a trained mind. Day by day, the reality shifted. What had once been laughed at became feared. Each successful engagement erased a layer of arrogance and replaced it with unease. The battlefield does not care where a weapon came from or how others perceive it. It responds only to results. 4 days passed, and with each day came undeniable proof that mockery is not strength, and tradition alone does not guarantee victory. This is the first lesson war teaches again and again. Underestimation is not merely an error. It is a weapon willingly handed to one's opponent. Those who assume weakness create strength where they least expect it. The enemy does not need superiority if they are granted carelessness. By dismissing what seemed unremarkable, they invited consequences they could not undo. But the rifle alone did not determine what followed. Tools do not choose targets. Tools do not endure exhaustion, hunger, or fear. Behind every effective instrument stands a human being willing to hone their skill beyond the limits of comfort. Equipment matters, yes, but skill determines how far equipment can go. Many possess weapons, few master them. Skill is built before the battlefield ever appears. It is shaped through repetition, through attention to detail that others consider excessive. It grows when frustration is met with persistence instead of resignation. In war, the illusion of shortcuts fades quickly. There is no substitute for preparation once the first shot is fired. The man behind that rifle did not rely on luck. He relied on what he had earned through effort unseen by spectators. Discipline is the quiet partner of skill. It is the ability to wait when impatience screams for action. It is the strength to hold position, maintain concealment, and resist panic even as danger draws close. Discipline turns chaos into manageable risk. Without it, even the finest equipment becomes dead weight. With it, even modest tools become formidable. Courage is often misunderstood as recklessness, but the battlefield exposes the difference. True courage is measured, deliberate, and restrained. Recklessness burns fast and leaves nothing behind. Courage endures, it adapts, it survives long enough to matter. The man who proved that rifle worthy did not seek attention. He sought effectiveness. He understood that survival and success are built on restraint as much as aggression. Precision, patience, and resolve combined into something greater than the sum of its parts. Shots were taken only when conditions allowed confidence, not hope. Positions were chosen with care, not convenience. Each action reflected respect for the reality of combat, where mistakes are not forgiven and luck eventually runs out. What remained constant was resolve, the refusal to back down simply because others doubted the approach. And then comes the third truth war forces upon all who witness it. Individuals are quickly turned into symbols. Stories travel faster than facts. Narratives form around events, often stripped of nuance and humanity. What begins as an account of survival and skill can be reshaped into legend, propaganda, or myth. Victories are magnified, losses are simplified. The man and the rifle became something larger than themselves. This transformation is dangerous if left unexamined. Legends inspire, but they can also blind. They risk glorifying destruction without acknowledging the cost. War does not produce heroes without also producing graves. Every success on one side carries suffering on another. To ignore this is to reduce war to entertainment, and that is a mistake history punishes harshly. The value of the story does not lie in the number alone, nor in the shock it produces. It lies in the reminder that human agency still matters, even when machinery grows more impressive by the year. War-era history often focuses on tanks, aircraft, and artillery, and rightly so. But these tools still depend on the judgment of those who use them. The smallest unit in any army remains the individual decision. The mocked rifle serves as a symbol not of superiority, but of humility before reality. It teaches that effectiveness cannot be measured purely by origin, appearance, or reputation. It must be tested, refined, and proven under pressure. Those who learn this lesson early adapt. Those who refuse to learn it are taught by force. There is also a warning embedded in the story. War rewards competence, but it does not care about morality on its own. Skill used without reflection can become cruelty. Discipline without conscience can become brutality. That is why history must be studied with clarity, not worship. Understanding how something happened does not require celebrating all that resulted from it. In times of conflict, societies look for meaning in chaos. They search for figures who seem to bend fate in their favor. Such figures become rallying points, sometimes exaggerated beyond recognition. Yet, the most valuable takeaway is never blind admiration. It is awareness of how fragile certainty truly is, and how quickly comfort can dissolve when assumptions are challenged. When mockery turns into silence, silence often turns into fear. Fear spreads faster than laughter ever did. It reshapes decisions, alters strategies, and forces reconsideration of what had seemed obvious. Confidence collapses not when strength disappears, but when understanding proves shallow. The collapse of certainty is often more damaging than defeat itself. The rifle did not change the war. 4 days do not decide a global conflict, but moments like these ripple outward. They influence training, tactics, and perception. They remind commanders and soldiers alike that complacency is lethal, and that respect for the opponent is not weakness, it is survival. This is why war demands seriousness. It punishes arrogance without hesitation. It exposes vanity and rewards preparation. Those who enter it believing They already know everything, quickly learn how little they truly understand. Those who remain observant, adaptable, and disciplined endure long enough to make a difference. In the end, the story is not about mocking laughter silenced by violence. It is about the cost of dismissing what we do not immediately value. It is about the danger of assuming superiority without proof. It is about the reality that progress, survival, and resistance often emerge from unexpected places. History remembers moments like this not because of their spectacle, but because they reveal uncomfortable truths. They remind us that appearances deceive, that skill outlasts prestige, and that courage often operates quietly, unnoticed, until results demand attention. They remind us that war is not a contest of slogans or symbols, but of endurance, judgment, and consequence. If there is inspiration to be taken, it must be tempered with responsibility. Let it encourage preparation over pride, respect over ridicule, and reflection over celebration. Let it warn against the ease with which narratives simplify suffering into numbers. Let it teach that even in the harshest circumstances, the human element remains decisive, and therefore accountable. Those who mocked learned too late that laughter offers no protection. Those who observed learned something far more valuable, that strength is not always announced, that respect must be earned through awareness, and that survival favors those who prepare diligently. Act deliberately and never confuse arrogance with confidence. That lesson reaches beyond any single battlefield. It belongs to anyone who faces pressure, doubt, or dismissal. History may set the stage, but the principle is universal. Do not underestimate. Do not mock what you do not yet understand. Do not confuse noise with power. In every era, the cost of those mistakes remains the same. They laughed first, and that laughter is where this story must begin, not with gunfire, not with numbers, not with legend, but with mockery. Mockery is easy, comfortable, and contagious. It requires little evidence and even less thought. In wartime especially, mockery becomes a shortcut to certainty. It reassures those who laugh that they understand the battlefield, that they know what matters and what does not. In this case, they mocked a rifle, its origin, its appearance, and the assumptions attached to it. They dismissed it as inferior before it was ever tested, and in doing so revealed more about their own thinking than about the weapon itself. History is filled with such moments. Armies, nations, and leaders repeatedly underestimate what does not conform to expectation. They trust reputation over reality, pedigree over performance. When a weapon seems unimpressive, it is easy to project weakness onto the person holding it. That projection is not accidental. It serves a psychological need. It allows soldiers to feel safer, commanders to feel smarter, and institutions to feel vindicated in their choices. But war is not obligated to respect those feelings. The critical lesson here is not the outcome, but the process that led to surprise. The rifle did not suddenly become effective because people stopped laughing. It was effective, or at least capable, long before that. What changed was perception. Mockery delayed recognition, and delayed recognition carries consequences in combat. When enemies are underestimated, they are not watched carefully. When they are not watched carefully, they find space to act. History punishes that chain of errors repeatedly, yet it persists. In this sense, the incident is not unique, nor is it exceptional. What makes it memorable is the way it disrupts simplified narratives of technological superiority. Modern warfare often encourages the belief that better equipment guarantees better outcomes. There is truth in that belief, but it is incomplete. Technology is only as effective as the doctrine, training, and judgment that accompany it. When those elements fail, even advanced systems falter. Conversely, when they are present, even modest tools can produce outsized effects. The man behind the rifle matters here, but not in the way legends often portray individuals. He did not transform the battlefield by force of personality or cinematic heroism. He applied skill within a specific context. He understood terrain, timing, concealment, and limitations. These are not mystical qualities, they are learned competencies. They emerge from training, experience, and attentiveness. The danger of legend making is that it replaces these realities with destiny or exceptionalism, obscuring how such outcomes actually occur. Critical history resists the urge to simplify. It asks not just what happened, but why it was allowed to happen and what systems enabled it. In this case, those systems included complacency, hierarchy, and assumptions baked into military culture. When certain weapons or methods are labeled inferior by doctrine, that judgment can calcify into blind spots. Tactical manuals cannot predict every encounter. Reality always retains the ability to surprise those who rely too heavily on expectation. The focus on the rifle also risks distracting from a more uncomfortable truth. War magnifies errors as efficiently as it does skill. Each successful engagement reflected not only competence on one side, but failure on another. Snipers are neutralized not merely by accuracy, but by lapses in countermeasures, movement discipline, and situational awareness. To frame the event purely as individual triumph is to ignore institutional vulnerabilities that made success possible. Yet stories like this are often retold in ways that strip them of complexity. Numbers take center stage. 4 days become a frame. Account replaces context. In the process, analysis gives way to astonishment, and astonishment lends itself easily to glorification. This is where critical historical thinking becomes essential. Counting outcomes without examining conditions risks turning war into spectacle rather than subject. War is already prone to distortion. Propaganda thrives on exceptional cases because they are emotionally efficient. They simplify messaging, boost morale, and create symbols that can be circulated widely. An unexpected weapon, an underestimated figure, and a rapid sequence of events make for a convenient narrative. But convenience is not accuracy. When such stories are repeated without examination, they become tools of persuasion rather than understanding. This does not mean the event lacks significance. On the contrary, its significance lies precisely in what it reveals about human behavior under pressure. It illustrates how quickly assumptions collapse when tested, and how fragile confidence becomes when built on incomplete knowledge. It underscores that warfare is as much cognitive as it is physical. Perception shapes action, and flawed perception invites danger. A critical perspective also demands attention to what is missing from celebratory retellings. The focus on kills, regardless of side, displaces human cost. Each engagement represents lives ended, families altered, and trauma extended. Reducing these realities to tally marks may seem efficient, but it is ethically impoverished. History that ignores suffering becomes arithmetic, not understanding. Moreover, wartime stories often detach events from their broader strategic context. A localized outcome, however dramatic, does not define a campaign or a war. Emphasizing isolated success can create the illusion of inevitability or dominance where none exists. Critical history places events on a spectrum, acknowledging their impact without inflating their significance. 4 days can be instructive without being decisive. The rifle itself becomes symbolic in hindsight, often standing in for broader ideas about ingenuity or defiance. Yet symbols are abstractions, and abstractions can mislead. The real lesson is not that unconventional tools always outperform conventional ones, but that rigid thinking consistently fails. Flexibility, observation, and respect for uncertainty are more reliable guides than doctrine alone. At the same time, it is important to resist romanticizing adaptation without limits. Warfare rewards learning, but it does not excuse brutality. Skill does not imply moral clarity. The effectiveness of an action is not the same as its ethical justification. Critical history holds these truths simultaneously, refusing to collapse competence into virtue. There is also a temptation to project modern values backward, framing individuals as lone disruptors against rigid systems. This too can oversimplify. Individuals operate within constraints, orders, resources, and expectations. Their actions are rarely isolated choices. They are shaped by environment and necessity. Recognizing this does not diminish agency, but situates it realistically. Another overlooked aspect is how quickly institutions absorb lessons once errors are exposed. Surprise may favor one side temporarily, but militaries adapt. Counters are developed, procedures change, the window of advantage closes. Stories that end at the moment of shock ignore the self-correcting nature of organized force. Critical history follows the thread beyond initial impact to long-term adjustment. In examining this event, we must also acknowledge the role of chance. No action in war is purely deterministic. Weather, visibility, movement, and timing all introduce variability. Skill increases probability. It does not eliminate uncertainty. Celebratory narratives often erase chance, replacing it with inevitability. This makes stories compelling but analytically weak. The mockery that began the story serves as a warning beyond warfare. It reflects a broader human tendency to conflate familiarity with superiority. We trust what resembles past success and dismiss what challenges it. Progress in military affairs or otherwise often emerges from those margins. Failure to recognize that reality repeatedly leads to surprise, disruption, and loss. Critical historical analysis therefore treats this incident less as a tale of triumph and more as a case study in error. It invites questions rather than applause. Why was the weapon dismissed so easily? Why were countermeasures insufficient? What assumptions guided behavior, and how were they reinforced? These questions are more valuable than any dramatic retelling. Such an approach does not drain history of meaning, it deepens it. It transforms events from anecdotes into lessons. It shifts focus from individuals to systems, from outcomes to processes. It resists the seduction of myth in favor of understanding, a choice that is far more difficult and far more necessary. In teaching history, the responsibility is not to inspire through exaggeration, but to illuminate through honesty. That includes acknowledging competence without celebrating killing, recognizing innovation without glamorizing violence, and learning from mistakes without assigning simplistic blame. War already distorts enough. History should not compound that distortion. In the end, the mocked rifle is less important than the mindset that dismissed it. That mindset has appeared before and will appear again in different forms under different flags. Its consequences will be similar each time. The critical task is not to retell the story louder, but to understand it more clearly. When we strip away legend, what remains is a sober reminder. Warfare is unforgiving to assumption, indifferent to pride, and relentless in exposing error. Those truths are neither heroic nor dramatic, but they are enduring. And if history is to serve any purpose beyond memory, it is to press those truths into the present with clarity rather than spectacle. That is how this episode should be remembered, not as a celebration of destruction, but as evidence of how easily confidence becomes vulnerability, how quickly mockery blinds judgment, and how urgently critical thinking is needed when lives hang in the balance. They doubted first. Doubt crept in disguised as laughter, arrogance wrapped in authority, certainty born without proof. They dismissed what did not conform to their expectations, not after examination, but before it. They believed judgment could precede evidence, that form mattered more than function, and that power announced itself clearly and loudly. They mistook familiarity for strength and tradition for inevitability, and in doing so they revealed a weakness far greater than the one they thought they saw. Authority is not declared by appearance, it is enforced by outcome. Order is not maintained by labels, but by results that cannot be ignored. Those who fail to understand this mistake the surface of control for its substance. They assume stability because it has lasted long enough to feel permanent. History exists precisely to punish that assumption. The object of their mockery did not protest. It did not demand recognition or approval. It waited. In discipline, waiting is not weakness. It is preparation. In hierarchy, silence is often mistaken for submission. That is an error repeated by those who confuse noise with dominance. What does not announce itself is often what endures. Every system produces blind spots. The larger and more confident the system, the wider those blind spots become. When authority grows accustomed to obedience, it stops listening. When it stops listening, it stops learning. And when it stops learning, it begins to decay even while it appears strong. Power that cannot adapt loses its edge long before it loses its form. The individual at the center of this moment did not challenge authority openly. He did not argue doctrine or overturn hierarchy. He operated within the structure while exposing its flaws through action. That is how true disruption occurs, not through declaration, but through demonstration. Results speak with a clarity that arguments never match. Day after day, consequence replaced assumption. Each outcome erased a layer of certainty that had gone unquestioned. Fear entered where confidence once lived. Control tightened where ease had prevailed. When authority realizes it does not fully command the field, its response is swift and severe. But reaction is not the same as mastery. By the time reaction begins, the advantage has already shifted. Authoritarian systems rely on predictability. They punish deviation because deviation threatens order. Yet war itself is the ultimate deviation. It refuses routine. It dismantles comfort. It exposes rigid systems as fragile the moment conditions change. The irony is constant. The stricter the structure, the more violently it breaks when reality refuses to comply. The weapon was never the point. The focus on the tool is a distraction useful for mythology, unhelpful for truth. What mattered was comprehension, understanding terrain, understanding timing, understanding psychology. Power is not merely the ability to strike. It is the ability to decide when not to. Authority exercised without restraint becomes wasteful. Control exercised without understanding becomes chaos wearing a uniform. Precision is discipline made visible. It is the correction of impulse, the mastery of attention, the refusal to act without purpose. In authoritarian language, discipline is often invoked but rarely understood. True discipline is not obedience to command alone. It is obedience to reality. Reality does not bend to rank. It responds only to competence. What unsettled command was not the loss itself, but the implication. If something so casually dismissed could produce such effect, what else had been overlooked? What assumptions were mistaken for laws? Once authority begins questioning itself, instability follows. The appearance of control depends on the belief that all meaningful variables are already known. Surprise disproves that belief decisively. Authoritarian narratives move quickly to contain such moments. They isolate them, rebrand them, reduce them to anomalies. This is necessary to preserve confidence. But containment does not equal correction. Labeling an event exceptional does not prevent its repetition. Suppression of lesson guarantees return of consequence. There is a reason the story circulates, not because it is entertaining, but because it irritates the conscience of command. It reminds leaders that hierarchy does not substitute for awareness, that systems designed to enforce order must still contend with unpredictability, and that authority unused to challenge becomes resented by reality itself. Yet, authoritarian speech often transforms such moments into mythology, symbols of dominance rather than warnings of vulnerability. That transformation serves morale, not understanding. It replaces inquiry with proclamation, but proclamation cannot repair error. It can only postpone recognition of it. Control demands vigilance. Vigilance demands humility before facts. Humility is intolerable to absolute authority because it suggests limitation. And yet limitation exists regardless of acknowledgement. This contradiction sits at the heart of every rigid system. It speaks loudly when silence would be safer. It mocks quietly when power performs loudly. The individual acted under no illusion that outcomes would be celebrated. Authoritarian systems reward obedience more reliably than effectiveness, but results have their own gravity. They cannot be ignored indefinitely. When they accumulate, they bend narrative whether leadership permits it or not. What followed was not admiration but recalibration, not praise but reassessment. That shift matters. Admiration personalizes events, reassessment institutionalizes them. The latter is fear, driven, cautious, and often incomplete, but it is rational. Power adapts not out of morality, but out of necessity, and necessity does not flatter. It demands recognition of flaws. It demands acknowledgement of error. It demands reform even when reform threatens prestige. The greatest weakness of authoritarian control is its reluctance to admit misjudgment. The longer that admission is delayed, the greater the eventual cost. The lesson, stripped of drama, is severe. Authority that mocks without examination invites erosion. Systems that ridicule deviation without assessment blind themselves. Power that mistakes compliance for understanding builds its own ambush. This truth is uncomfortable because it assigns responsibility not to chaos, not to chance, not to fate, but to decision makers. It insists that outcomes are not mysterious. They emerge from choices, priorities, and neglected questions. Authoritarian structures dislike such insistence because it undermines the myth of inevitability. War exposes myths harshly. It reduces language to consequence. It removes insulation. It reveals whether authority was built on comprehension or on momentum. Momentum can carry power forward for years. It can collapse in days once friction is introduced. None of this makes the event virtuous. Effectiveness is not morality. Success is not justification. Authoritarian rhetoric often conflates the two because it requires them to be fused. Critical observation separates them. It recognizes competence without sanctifying its results. When the narrative becomes only about dominance, learning stops. When learning stops, repetition begins, and repetition in war is fatal. Systems survive by adaptation, not by intimidation alone. Intimidation decays. Adaptation evolves. This story endures because it reminds authority of its limits. It whispers that power unexamined weakens itself. that dismissal is a luxury afforded only to those not yet tested. And that silence, preparation, and patience can dismantle certainty faster than any speech. Order is preserved not by shouting louder, but by seeing clearly. Control is maintained not by crushing variance, but by understanding it. Authority that fears scrutiny will eventually face it under worse conditions. That is the true disruption, not the tally, not the time frame, but the exposure of arrogance as inefficiency. The demonstration that certainty unsupported by awareness is not strength, but delay. In every system that prizes dominance, moments like this recur. They are either studied or erased. The systems that survive are the ones that study them without sentiment. The ones that fall are those that turn them into slogans. Power demands obedience. Reality demands competence. When the two diverge, reality always prevails.